I'm Ed Zimmer, the city's Lincoln Historic Preservation Planner, and we're all invited here by the Preservation Association of Lincoln. May is Preservation Month. We're pretending this is May. This is the last event of the PAL season for Preservation Month. And we're going to walk Centennial Mall, currently at least in the absence of Karen Nalow, who I wish was here. She's one of the designers, landscape architect with Clark Anderson, and one of the designers of the mall. I will get all of her stuff wrong. Richard, you can step in and help anytime I'm...
I have a lot of questions for her.
Questions actually help along the way, so I'd be happy to have questions. I want to start with a little background of the space we'll walk through, because it isn't just that we're on the steps of the Capitol. Capitol is, of course, the third one built on this site, built between 1922 and 32. The site itself is laid out in the original 1867 plan of the city. When Lincoln was declared, when Lancaster was declared the state capital, the commissioners who had made that decision drew a map, a plat of what this future city would look like. And they created about 3,000 house sites. They created 3 super blocks, and this was one of those, the Capitol Square, or State House Square as they labeled it, a campus for a university that did not yet exist, and a park, which they weren't even, I think, quite sure what a park would become, but Cooper Park is that park. The heart of the university campus, 10th to 12th and R to T streets is that campus. But the university isn't founded for 2 more years. So they're thinking ahead. And the Capitol site, and each of those big super blocks was met because they would be crossing the grid of streets, J and 15th Street. Those streets were given extra right-of-way. The ordinary streets of the city were 100 feet wide, already very wide for horse and buggy, grass, sidewalks, but 100 feet of public right-of-way space. These ones crossing the super blocks were 120 feet wide. And that still establishes the width that we're heading up to the university. But you also have to imagine that plan went from 1st to 17th and A to O. And then above O Street, it only went from 7th to 14th because it was just kind of surrounding that campus. And so as we look north, as we view up to O Street, we look over the edge of the original plat. O Street, 15th and O is a block beyond. When adjacent owners start platting out the ground around the city, and they do that on every side almost from the first day, north of O, they didn't bother to put in a 15th Street. There was an alley, there were houses, there were buildings, but it didn't connect up to campus. Campus only came to 12th, so they didn't even put in a 15th Street. And as Lincoln developed in its first 70 years, there was no 15th north of O. So the old views from the Capitol looking north, you see a group of buildings on the view north. The campus expands in the teens, reaches over to 14th, and then the Greek Row area is added. And so there suddenly becomes a reason that you might go from the Capitol up to R Street, but you can't. And it isn't until, well, I've got to keep my sequence going. We're going to tear down the second Capitol after we've built 3/4 of the office block of this Capitol around it. And we tear it down in about 1925 to build the tower and close off the 4th side of the Capitol. Goodhue had a vision that eventually, as more state offices were needed, they probably ought to be positioned around the Capitol, not in the building. It isn't designed to be expanded unless you went 500 feet tall or 900 feet tall. So he was envisioning this would be a civic precinct with state buildings, like almost every side of it has today. He was also envisioning that north of it would become a civic area with a wide landscape median. All we had was 120 feet of right-of-way at that time. No median, no special ornament to the north part of the reach. But he's envisioning it and suggesting it. And there become efforts through the 20s. The building's finished in 32. And soon after, the city starts acquiring the land north of O Street, 120 feet wide, buying buildings, condemning some property, controlling that whole 120-foot space for the additional 3 blocks. And it's in the late 30s, early 40s, right before you as a 4-year-old are photographed looking at the building, that finally there is a 120-foot right-of-way all the way from from the Capitol to R Street. City starts its comprehensive planning process in the 1950s. The first Lincoln Comprehensive Plan shows a scheme for decorating that space between the Capitol and the campus. A center median, divided lanes, somewhat like the South Goodhue Boulevard area, and civic buildings along it, including a notion of a county city building where state office building is built. Doesn't become county city building. That's, of course, on the designated land laid out in the original plan to the west, but those big ideas about what should be built along it. Pershing Auditorium is shown on that plan. It isn't yet built. The Historical Society building is shown on that plan, not yet built. So they're really thinking big in the first comprehensive plan, and they're saying we ought to do something about making this a boulevard. It doesn't occur for another 10 plus years. Centennial Mall, of course, is named for the centennial of statehood, 1967, Nebraska being declared a state in 1867. And so Centennial Mall is then built 66, 67, 68. Original Centennial Mall is designed by Larry Enerson, great Lincoln landscape architect. It's built somewhat on a theme of the steps you're sitting on, because while we don't really see a lot of topography when we stand up here, you see even less when you're up on the tower, there is, the land does go down towards O and then back up towards R Street. And they build this beautiful series of steps on each of those blocks, reflecting the proportions and this look of the north side of the Capitol. They build 2 fountains on the first block. Let's see, what is it? 2 on the first, 1 on the second. A couple more up towards the university, big, beautiful square basin fountains. Haystack design of the water spouts, great postcard fountains. Really boring fountains in the winter, except for the leaves they gather. Scary fountains in the summer because there was no curb or anything else around them, and occasionally people would fall into them. Nice scenic fountains, but not really something that was going to endure. The steps start deteriorating. The pavement was what's called an exposed aggregate, big pebbles on the surface of the concrete. Looks really nice for what, a year, 2 years? Real problem with it is as it starts deteriorating, you can't patch it in any way that doesn't look like you just patched it. It's a handsome surface for a little while. So the surface starts getting bad, the fountains start leaking. There was a pathway that ran all the way through it. Pretty innovative in the 1960s to have an accessible route from one end to the other. But that pathway zigzagged back and forth every block. Maybe for an idea that if you were in a wheelchair, you ought to get a central view of the Capitol as well. In fact, you had to, because you had to go back and forth across every block. There were subtle water features built in as well. There was a little sort of canal system that went from one side to the other that also failed quite early. So we had this beautiful space, 2 blocks on this end, 2 blocks on the other, pedestrian space, but even quite early it starts failing. The trees on either side were planted in big basins. They quickly got bigger than their basins and started cracking them. So we had all kinds of problems over the length of the life of it. An outdoor space 50 years old is not surprising will need renovation. This one badly needed renovation because we were probably at a lot of risk of anybody who walked over it on a given day, and it was inaccessible back and forth. Richard.
I understand that there was one block section in there where they never removed the pavement. that caused all sorts of...
Yeah, I think we had some brick streets underneath, up to about the end. I'd have to ask Karen for which one it was, because I think it finally got demoed in this project. The fountains were hard to maintain. We started filling in the fountains through the years, and they became grass, big grass squares, not too elegant of a design. The effort to rebuild Centennial Mall, which we'll look at today, took about the last 15 years. City's Capital Environs Commission had been promoting it that long. We had adopted a beautiful plan that a national landscape architecture firm, EDAW, had designed. They had done, the drawings were beautiful. It's a good thing it never got built.
Yeah, the problem with it is it showed every different kind of hardscape material you can imagine.
It was spectacular. About $20 million about 15 years ago. They were the same firm that designed the Olympic Plaza in Atlanta, and had a huge reputation. They wanted to close the 3 central blocks. That went over real well with the people that wanted to drive on the 3 central blocks. And they had these gorgeous surfaces of every stone from around the whole world, and this big back and forth pattern across it, and was impossible economically, impossible in city planning terms. A good exercise in if you had all the money in the world and chose to ignore lots of other issues, what might you build? It didn't get built, but was a step towards what do we really want to do here? It has to be done. What might we be able to afford? This is about a $9 million project as it was. It's a combination of city money, a lot of TIF, tax increment financing of some of the projects around it. State put in some money, finally, and it was the first time in all of the efforts that the state had come forward to cooperate on it. County put in money, and then private fundraising to get that $9 million figure, which includes about $1 million of endowment, so that as major work needs to be done on it, Parks now has a source to keep that going. Because you can't build a space like this pretending you won't need to maintain it. You're lying to yourself and everybody else. So this is built now with an endowment. Key designers were the Clark Anderson Partnership. Their key client was the City Parks Department, overseeing it, and the Environs Commission looked at every aspect of it along the way, to the point that they review each of the inscriptions on the plaques so that there is some public process. If you want to pay the $10,000 to $25,000 to put a plaque up, and you want to put something offensive in, they won't let you. Short of that, you want to say whatever you want about your grandmother, your grandfather, as long as it's not offensive, and you have the funds, you can still, we think there's about 7,000 spaces for plaques. Jeff Searcy, who chairs the commission, is a realtor, and he keeps saying there's a lot of good real estate between here and there. When you measure out 7 blocks, about half a mile, either 18 or 36 inches at a time on both sides of the mall, there's a lot of plaque possibilities. We'll see some of those plaques along the way. I think that's the shady part of the show. I think we have to go out and walk in the sun now. The key things about the design of throughout the mall is the designers drew specific elements off the Capitol itself. And so throughout the mall, a lot of the fine detail, a lot of the decorative elements are directly referring back to the Capitol, both inside and outside. We can't quite see one here. As we get a little further down, that walkway that runs all along the first floor of the Capitol on the exterior has a little zigzag bronze piece in the stone railings where they, kind of the little relief areas in the railings. That zigzag pattern is what we'll see on the bollards, the trash containers, the benches. Lots of the elements are drawn directly off the Goodhue 1920s vocabulary of the Capitol.
Looks like the reveals on those short walls also pick up the
yeah, they do. Yeah,
points.
and a lot of these walls that might today be plain are opportunities if somebody came along that limestone relief could be added. So like the Capitol itself, which is left with, from the beginning, with areas where you could add decoration, further embellishment, that intention is built in the mall as well, and we'll talk about some of that as we go. You'll see the lights also have a reference to the bronze light standards that we see here on the plaza and circling the mall. They're not exactly the Capitol lights, can't afford exactly the Capitol lights, and there's also a feeling those belong, and they're gorgeous antique lights around the Capitol itself. You want to refer to them, but you don't want to try to exactly copy those elements.
So these Capitol lights would be very expensive to replicate, or are expensive?
I think they would be. They're bronze, and really they're looking not quite so much at these two as the ones all around the square. So they don't do the double heads, they do a single, they do a similar geometry, and what they really do most of all is establish that same kind of frame. When you come upon the Capitol on any of the streets driving by at night, and you can see the little curve of the land because the lights trace that, these are part of establishing that wall at either side of the mall. The walkways do it, the planting does it, and the lights do that as well. It's all about framing the edges and looking south to the Capitol Tower.
Are the first lights taller, or is that the slope of the lane?
That's the slope, yeah. I think the only place that trick is played, that perspective trick, is these concolor fir planted on either side of it, where the taller ones are near you and they go down to the Capitol, and as you get further back, it's even taller. It's wearing heels. We'll see if I can be heard above the splash. And the splash is a very intentional part of creating an atmosphere where you've got fairly busy streets, but you want to create a space that is a space apart. And the sound of the fountain is as important as the verticality of the fountain. These fountains are set that, unlike the original ones which had one form, these will vary during their sequence. And so in a little while it ought to start looking like it's failing and then look like it's confused, and then it'll turn off. And you'll see the plaza of the fountain is the seal of the state of Nebraska, rendered in granite. See? Now, if it were a really windy day, that little wind detector on the second light in would also start picking up when it's windy enough that walking by you would get soaked, and that will turn it off as well. But what we're seeing here is the programmed sequence of fountain all the way up. It'll start down again, it'll go quiet for a moment. I imagine there will be times in the summer when young people will walk across it and it'll start up again, and it won't hurt them a bit, but they'll get wet. It also is designed so that in the winter it still is a plaza space. It is decorative, it still carries out its overall intention. But there is the seal. I think it's called Cold Spring granite. I think all of the granite is from basically that same source. And also point out just the beautiful detail of so much of the work on the mall. The drain element with that lovely pattern is drawn off the Capitol. I can't quite see any of the railing pieces from here, but we see those throughout. And so it'll rest for just a moment, and then it'll get going again. There's also, well, some other elements on this block. We mixed the limestone and granite, which is sort of the base of the Capitol and the stairs of the Capitol, and then the main tower, in these benches along the way. The nice little decorative stainless steel domes also are to keep it an unpleasant area to skateboard, to grind across the edge of that and break off the stone. You have to, and you still see it does occur some, and you have to deal in the design in some purposeful way with that isn't really what that's there for. There's a variety of ways to do it, but this is one of the elegant, simple ones to try to address it. And as we look, let's go on down I think we're all walking today, so we'll vary. We won't just use the paths, we'll use stairs as well.
And on this level, is that the only commemorative plaque so far, Abraham Lincoln Cornhusker Bank?
I think that is. They also are very conscious of recognizing the sponsors of different spaces, and they do that mostly through the plaques as well. Where you see a bronze 18 by 36, you can have one of those for a mere $25,000. So I haven't bought my first one, much less my second one. Some of the donors, you will see 4 or 5 of those in a row. That would be, there are some $100,000 donors on the mall, and they have multiple plaques. The various spaces also have special spaces like this one. Like there is a fountain donor, and so they tried to work out how you would do that donor recognition, but build it into the overall design. They call the pathway, and these granite parts of these benches carry that line of the pathway. Either side has the broad sidewalk, and then there's an 18-inch band on the inside on both sides, and they call it the Spirit of Nebraska Pathway. And that's where all of the Hall of Fame honorees are reflected in that pathway, and then donors. And as you get in the middle blocks, a lot of them are the 18 by 18 granite, and that's the $1,000. Anybody who wants one and has something to say, we get they're like limericks. You get a certain number of characters, a certain number of lines. You have to fit whatever it is into that. And then I get to look at it and try to make it grammatical, and the commission looks at it and makes sure it's not offensive.
Do they have a choice of where they can put it?
Some degree of choice, although each block has kind of a broader overall theme. This block, in the designer's mind, they call We the People, and it reflects things directly related to state and state government. So most of the Hall of Fame are here. Second block they call Our Home Nebraska, and all 93 counties have recognition there, and then a lot of individuals. There's also a logo symbol on each one, and those vary. They're all drawn directly off the Capitol. There are 5 different ones, and they kind of have a connection to law. There's scales of justice, there's a corn cob, there's a bison, and each one of those is kind of a little thematic touch. They're on both sides on the inside 18 inches of the walkway area, or the equivalent of where the darker granite benches are. That's the pathway line.
And Glenn Korf is on the...
Glenn Korf's all over because he's got a couple million, or on his death, his designees gave a couple million to the mall. This also is a little fountain element that's just sort of a little stream that will trickle down here and in the next block, and today it's not running, or I don't see it at the moment. You see a little bit of iron spot in the pavement of this plaza. When they first put this in, the blend had a lot of iron in it and a lot of rust spots, and Parks turned it down and required that they redo it. It was not as spec'd, and we have a little iron, which is not distracting, but it doesn't look like the whole plaza is rusting out, which was fairly distracting. So they were supervising very closely, and I felt real good about the contractors they were using. Both the upper plaza and this intermediate one and the grass are also seen as sort of a direct extension of the Capitol front yard, where lots of events and bigger celebrations, protests, civic purposes happen on the Capitol steps, and this block is seen as an extension and allowing even a bigger crowd and a bigger gathering, which is why there's also open grass through the center of these. The whole purpose of the place is a gathering space, but also a viewing space. So nothing taller than us happens down the center of the mall. This is part of that pattern drawn off the railings around the promenade of the Capitol. There's recognition of the past donors and elements of the mall. So the eternal flame, which we don't sort of do anymore in Energy More Conscious days, is recognized in one of the plaques. Then the basic layout of the big plaques, and these would be the Hall of Fame plaques, will be a name, an inscription, a hometown, a logo, so Chief Justice Hastings gets the scales of justice, And then there's a whole program built in as well called Education on Location. And currently that's carried out through the little QR code that if you scan that, you will link into a web page that has more information about each of the elements of the mall. I don't expect that forever QR codes will be how we do that kind of access. And I think, in fact, today, lots of folks could scan that name and get to the same spot. Underneath that handsome little ceramic plaque is a rosette, so that when we don't need those anymore, we pop them off and it still is a nice finished looking plaque. You can see the Hall of Fame honorees are indicated, and that's the Spirit of Nebraska pathway. But I can also confidently walk backward on these because there are no steps, one end to the other than the curbs, on the pathway on either side. The trees as they grow up are, the main tree planted along the mall is red oak, which has done real well in downtown Lincoln. In the last half block, it is concolor firs, like the trees framing the north steps of the Capitol. But these aren't planted in little tight collars that will choke them out and make them old dead trees before their time. If you think of the trees along particularly the north side of Lincoln Mall from the Capitol to the County City building, those are red oaks planted when Lincoln Mall was created in the mid-1980s. They're gigantic and beautiful and healthy and feed thousands of squirrels, or they could if they had those nuts every year. These are in even bigger planting areas, but they're comparable, so that they should have a chance really to become major urban trees. The question of whether there's significance to the pattern on the crossings is very deliberate and is part of trying to keep that continuity going. I think it's a general reference to some of the ornament in the Capitol, but I don't know if there's a specific spot that occurs. But each of these intersections we'll cross is decorated to keep that continuity one end to the other. You also notice up at the Capitol, we had choices of 2 crosswalks. You don't usually get that, particularly on a non-primary crossing. When it was first presented, there was going to be 1 crosswalk, and the commission pushed real hard to say that continuity on both sides needs to continue up to the last step, and it'll be safer, and they'll kind of go off together, and nobody's stopping twice at those, and Public Works agreed and saw the wisdom of that. Bless them. So this block is referred to as Our Home Nebraska. The plaza has a Nebraska map in the center. The pattern, this is the only block where you get a very different pattern on the walkway portion with these pavers in concentric circle. Think raindrop, think pond, and circle of dropping a pebble in the water. This is the Platte and the Ogallala Aquifer side of Our Home Nebraska. As we come to the center, it becomes very explicit in a map of Nebraska. And this is the block that has probably the finest historic building short of the Capitol, framing the wall. Scottish Rite Temple in 1916, Ellery Davis design, right at the time Ellery and George Berlinghoff were finishing their partnerships. And a very handsome limestone building. That ornamental top, which seems to look like they spent a lot of time carving their limestone. They actually spent a little time molding their terracotta, but perfectly in color reference with the rest of the building. But you have to imagine when that was built, it was sitting on an urban street with cars parked in front of it, but it's strong enough, it holds itself very well on this setting too. Now, when they laid this out, they were not confused about what color of pavers to use. They were referring to different ecoregions of the state, different soil types, different basic underlying ecologies, and that's what the overall plaza is representing, with then the political reality, but also kind of a human fiction construct of the outline of Nebraska laid onto the natural landscape. The major rivers are shown, the major rail lines are shown. The stars are the county capitals, and the counties are identified in the Spirit of Nebraska walkway on either side of the central plaza. In addition to the railroad, there's a pattern to this end of little bear claw prints and dates on each one, and that's the pathway that the Ponca forced out of their lands on the Niobrara, followed in 1877 down to Oklahoma. The Ponca Trail of Tears. Almost every tribe, unfortunately, had a Trail of Tears, and this was where they were each date along the path, walking and riding wagons all the way from northern Nebraska down to Oklahoma. Family members were lost along the way. The bear claw is partly a reference to Standing Bear, one of the leaders who is taking that path, gets down to Oklahoma, goes to Washington to plead with the federal government that his people were dying in Oklahoma. They weren't used to the climate, they weren't especially used to malaria, and a third of the tribe died in the first 2 years in Oklahoma. And Standing Bear, rejected in Washington, takes off one January to walk back home. And he gets as far as the Omaha Reservation in 1879 on his walk home and is arrested there by General Crook on order of the Department of the Interior. Finds friends in Omaha, particularly Thomas Tibbles, a young journalist who recruits a couple of local attorneys, including one young man who I think did all the work, John Webster, and one older man, Poppleton, who was the Union Pacific's chief counsel. And so he had some weight, and they filed the case, a habeas corpus case, to have the government prove why they had the right to arrest this man and his family group. And they won that court hearing in Omaha in May of 1879 and began to establish that Native people were in fact simply people and had rights as others did have. But this is a reflection of that pathway in 1877 that began the events began long before that, but key moments in that key part of Nebraska history. So we're laying natural events, natural spaces, natural environment, and political outlines, and then events like building of the railroad, where the major rivers are, all in this space. Various of the key tribes of Nebraska are reflected in the low seating walls, 4 of the major tribes. When we get up to the block by the Children's Museum, the 20-some tribes that have historic connections to Nebraska are all recognized up on that block as well. And then lots of the plaques. We have all of the counties shown with their county seats, and then lots of individual name plaques on this block as well. It was quite a trek. This was a summer trek, and Standing Bear lost 2 grandchildren on this trip. When they came back up, unauthorized, it was January. It was incredible.
I was at the Neely Cemetery last week, and that's where one of the kids is buried.
Yeah, and Neely still honors and decorates, I think maybe White Flower, I think maybe was that granddaughter's name.
I can't remember the name,
But when they lost that child there, Neely kind of said, we'll honor her grave, and they still do.
And what county is that?
Antelope.
Antelope.
Yeah.
Well, good for them.
Yeah. The fountain along here is the Missouri River. That's what's going on when it sprouts, is showing the key path of the Missouri forming the north and east boundary of the state. We have photos of they laid the whole plaza. They then There are photos of the workers on their bellies on cushions, sandblasting the rivers into the plaza. Well, let's see if we can just ford across the Missouri if you're feeling bold. That's tall. But if you need to know where the county seats are, you can work it out if you can find it within the 93. That's also something of a connection back to the Capitol, where inscribed around the outer side of the Capitol are the 93 counties of the state. And I think in part reflecting, rather than putting them alphabetical here, they're not alphabetical around the Capitol either. They are typographical. They are where Hartley Burr Alexander could make them fit in with the architecture, get all 93 in, and not have it look funny. So we have counties of many different lengths, and he managed to make them all.
But they are geographically kind of, because my home county, they're all right around there. So he.
This is more. This isn't just random. This is somewhat taking its walk across the state. There are plaques for the 4 tribes that are honored on the benches with a little more explanation, and then their education on location piece to refer back to more information on them. Osney Ponca, or Cold Ponca, are the folks who came back from Oklahoma, and I can't remember the proper term, but the other Ponca are the warm Ponca who stayed in Oklahoma. So Osney is cold. And this would be an example of one of the family plaques that has a specific agricultural and land reference and seemed well placed. Another ranch and farm family. So it seemed like good ones for this block on Our Home, Nebraska. These 3 central blocks obviously are still left as vehicular blocks, but a lot of attention was given to them as well. It might be what we would call complete streets, where you can drive, walk, decorate, and all of that can still occur. There are plaques along them. Chris and Judy Beitler's plaque is here. They donated. A lot of rain garden elements are built into the mall so that this is a gathering place for stormwater, clean it up before it gets into the main sewer system. A lot of the trees that are in smaller areas are planted in silvacells, so they'll have enough soil around them hopefully to grow even if they're more constricted. You might have noticed on the last block we suddenly got a couple trees planted on the other side of the sidewalk. It happens kind of on the lower corner. Those I think are to pick up the line. Once you get to this block, you want a little more separation from the street, and so not the big oaks, but a decorative tree is planted, and those kind of pick up and carry the continuity of that element. The big planting bowls that we get a little further down on this block right in front of Old Pershing are shaped like some of the native pottery and are a reference to those forms. There really wasn't a planting bowl precedent in the Capitol that make a real direct reference, and so instead they turned to some of the forms of native peoples of Nebraska.
Are there active plans for Pershing?
Are there active plans for Pershing? There's a lot of active discussion of Pershing. There aren't active completed plans of Pershing. Most of the discussion involves the building going away.
When was that?
Which seat? Well, 56 or 57.
The tree grates that carry the continuity of the pathway along the tree plantings here are some of the grate patterns from the floor of the Capitol. So that here they are cast iron. I think they are bronze in the Capitol. Cast iron is a nice outdoor element that will reach to this point and stay here. But that's a direct Capitol link as well. A lot of people ask about the mural. I think anybody can have it who wants it. It unfortunately is built in, well, for better or for worse, it's part of the wall. It wasn't put up in a way that it really has any way of removing it other than taking that much of wall. One of the puzzles then is, where would you put? What building wants to have that on it of that size? It's a big piece. It's by a couple of Nebraska artists. It is done in 1-inch tiles. I think they have buckets of those 1-inch tiles inside where they've fallen off. But it's a very fond feature for a lot of people, and is something of a puzzle. I get in trouble because I don't like it as a work of art. I understand it as a piece of nostalgia, but I can't quite figure out the figures.
It's a modernist
Yeah, a lot of sports
design.
figures.
As Norm Getzky used to say, not very good work by not the best artists, or something close to that, which I can cite because he's Norm Getzky.
Are these flower planters the same design of the?
These are the ones that are drawn quite closely from some of the Nebraska native pottery, including that band pattern on them. You may recognize some of the people along the pathway. Lots more opportunity for you. These are the, I think there were the 1, 10, and 25,000. That's 25. The granite squares are 1,000. This area, the public right-of-way, includes the front planting area in front of the foundation building. I think the steps are about where their private property starts, so that planting area was reworked as well in the mall work. The N Street bike path was being planned after the mall overall plan was completed. It was carefully studied to work the crossing pattern into it and let the two be kind of compatible design elements. And I think neither one offends the other. One of the elements the Capitol Environments Commission was quite interested in is whether it be possible to shorten the arms of the signals at a couple of these intersections where the light sits out in the middle of your view. And Public Works has agreed that if Parks can find the money, they can find the engineering to make it happen. So those might get much shorter over time. There's only a couple of those and it's not a real high traffic street. You can see how the street drains right into these corner features so that the stormwater will first drain through that filter before it goes down into the storm system and eventually into Salt Creek.
Is that used anyplace else in Lincoln?
The question is whether that's done anywhere else in Lincoln. I think one of the first streetscapes with a kind of biofilter like that is South 48th and College View along Union College.
11th Street too, I think.
11th Street was, subsequent has some of those built in as well. So it's probably College View, 11th, these would be about the sequence. If you remember, this space leading up to the federal parking garage was basically concrete from center line to the building. With 120 feet, there's plenty of room for a lot of grass there. And so the walkway comes out along the street, carries that clean line up to Capitol, and softens that building. The grass is the nicest part of that building. A question of the life expectancy of the plaques. I think that a challenge with them is keeping them legible. I think as long as that black within the granite is maintained, they stay pretty legible. Granite is exceptionally hard. Lots of granite at Wyukas looks new 100 years later. This is deliberately put to the side so you can clear the path in the winter without really having to engage the granite. So they've tried to take all that into account. Are there parts yet to be completed? Some of the decorative elements, yes, and when we get up past the History Museum, the Standing Bear statue, which will be coming this September, will be a major part. The frame is all done, and I think the planting's all done, best of my knowledge, but decorative elements can be added as long as we keep maintaining it. The question about the Standing Bear statue, when it's planned to be installed in September this year. The clay is completed, the molds have been drawn off the clay. It's headed to the foundry for casting. Then there's the patina process and putting it up. We have to make some alterations to the setting, and I'll talk about those on the next block.
Where's the statue go?
What's that?
Where's it going to go?
Next block, I'll show you exactly. I'll have you stand there, in fact, give a scale. We're in an environment here where in the upgrade of the mall, your left-hand side is part of the work. The walkway is, the wall is in place from alterations to the federal building after the Oklahoma City bombing. The GSA plan was simply to put a barrier wall around the building. The Environs Commission pushed very hard. Doesn't actually have any authority on the federal government. We didn't admit that. That it be a planting area as well as a wall. I think a wall without the plants would be much less safe. It would look like you were putting up a wall to say you can't get past this. Now you see a planting area, which if you try to drive through it, you won't get through it. Good spot to view the History Museum. In their renovation, they added this public art feature of elements inside the museum, things like upper left, a native doll and a Cupid doll, historic keys, tennis shoes, and moccasins. All objects that are within the museum, trying to reflect the range of elements and the range of subject matter they try to cover within the Nebraska History Museum. The last two northern blocks are referred to in the design, the master design of the mall, as imagination to innovation, and trying to pick up themes from the Children's Museum, the Journalism College, and then the campus itself. So we have kind of working in sequence up the block. These benches all have an alphabet letter on them, and then as we start up we get words both in a native language and then in English, and the idea is that you're going from the building blocks and the basics through whole concepts and words, and then eventually inscriptions, and then you're at the university and the fairly complex thought that hopefully goes on there. So it's kind of each step along the way. This next part of the plaza, this sculptural niche was built into the layout of the mall with the intention that that should be a place that sculpture would eventually be featured. Just as the mall was being finished, or actually even before the space was quite finished, the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs and Judy Goshkabosh, the executive director, came forward with a proposal and a donor to create a monumental bronze statue of Standing Bear to be featured in this space. Commission was enthusiastic about that concept and will adapt the wall. This statue will be essentially the same size as the Lincoln statue. When you think of that, you stand up and look at the Lincoln and you're kind of just talking to him eye to eye. That's a 9-foot statue. It's on a 6-foot pedestal. It's got a 400-foot building behind it. And that all works beautifully together there since 1912 to make that plaza. This is a different space, but the figure will be essentially that size. be on probably a 36-inch base, so it'll be a more intimate experience. It also is in this long horizontal space. It's in a mile or a half a mile of horizontal space, and there's a very clear line essentially established by the lights on either side that is sort of the top of this space before the sky. So you don't want to have this wall. The wall will be augmented essentially by about 4.5 feet, and it's that unit of the bigger and smaller horizontals will be added on top in granite. So it will, you can't add to concrete and have it look like you did something other than add to concrete, but you could put granite on top of it.
It won't be limestone.
It won't be limestone, it will be granite. It'll be that dark, cold spring granite. The very base under the self base of the statue will also be granite. It will be notched like the granite doorways in the memorial chamber. So its wheel stops for skating will be notched into the granite itself. Benjamin Victor is a sculptor. He's a young, late 30-year-old sculptor. He has 2 works in the National Capitol in Washington, in Statuary Hall today. This is as good as, what he's shown us is as good as those or better. It's a lovely statue of Standing Bear. We'll have a brief inscription beside it, and then his name in English and in Ponca accompanying the statue. It seems to be on track and on schedule to be finished and installed in the sesquicentennial year, aiming at this September. The circle feature that we see in this, with the paths crisscrossing it, there's a granite circle within those paths, has a little light honoring the, I believe, 21 tribes with historic associations to Nebraska. So it isn't that this is a native block, but there's a lot of native reference in several blocks, but particularly in this one, with Standing Bear, the language, and then the tribal circle. The next block, which we can see from here, and the clouds are suggesting, and the time when we said I think would bring you back to the museum for refreshments at 2:30, would say, we'll look at the next block and I'll tell you about it. Has Temantah, Gene Heistein's sculptural works that originally were installed in the early 1980s next to Old City Hall. Heistein's very well recognized, died a few years ago, but internationally known minimalist sculptor. Those are black granite, all very carefully carved. They're kind of corduroy on every surface, but in the shape of natural boulders, often referred to in Lincoln as lump and bump. He had a bigger idea, and Temantah are, I believe, sunrise and sunset, Egyptian gods, and he had a scheme that was a more full development of that little space next to Old City Hall that wasn't funded. When that was developed into the little park space with a fountain next to Old City Hall, Parks got in touch with Heistein, brought him to Lincoln, and discussed some possible locations with him. Lynn Johnson reports that Heistein said, usually I don't hear anything when somebody moves or destroys or throws away my sculpture, and you brought me back to talk to me about it and liked this new setting. And in fact, I think it's more effective than that little crowded urban space next to Old City Hall. They're nice figures that don't violate the, we don't do tall things down the center, and they have a nice dignified space there. So I think it works out quite nicely. At the very end, the R Street end of the space, there's a little curved wall. They call it Reflection Plaza, and it's where you stand at the greatest distance to look down to the Capitol. And there will be 6 plaques in that wall, one for each of the 3 capitals, talking about, with an illustration, talking about the 1868 Capitol, the 1880s Capitol, and the present building. And then one on the west side for 3 steps of the development of this space. So one will talk about that 1867 original plan of the city with the emphasis on these axial drives to the key spots. One will talk about the extension of the physical space and and then Centennial Mall being created in the 60s, and one will talk about this project. So those 3 of the space and 3 of the buildings will be permanently displayed at the north end in that little R Street Plaza. And that's all there is to Centennial Mall, which we now generally refer to as Nebraska's Centennial Mall, to distinguish it just subtly from that last version of it, which was just plain Centennial Mall.